Welcome, Ingrid.
Okay, thank you, Anne, for that kind introduction, and thank you for inviting me today. Okay, so before I begin my discussion today of Russia's first philosopher, Pyotr Chaadaev, I'd like to briefly point your attention to a relatively recent news item in the New York Times, and I feel like please bear with me, it is relevant to what I'm talking about today. This article concerns a March 2023 legal case in Massachusetts, where the state Supreme Court ruled against instating a civility code in public meetings, citing the Revolutionary era enshrinement of the right to, quote, rail against King George III, known as the Royal Brute. This ruling came despite the fact that public meetings have become quite uncivil in recent years. As the article points out, founding fathers John and Samuel Adams drafted Article 19 of the Massachusetts Constitution to protect citizens' quote, right to request redress of the wrongs done them and of the grievances they suffer. And the state Supreme Court justices noted that this article aimed to protect the colonists' freedom to rail against King George III, specifically in a profane and ungracious manner. And as they stated, quote, there was nothing respectful or courteous about the public assemblies of the Revolutionary period. There was also much that was rude and personal, especially when it was directed at the representatives of the king and the king himself. And so my aim here is not to weigh in on the appropriateness of the recent ruling, but to note instead that the issue of the right of citizens to show disrespect to leaders and the emotions involved in this process are alive and well, and that this is certainly a phenomenon that Chaadaev would recognize and applaud. As I will discuss today, one of the seminal characteristics of Chaadaev was his show of explicit disrespect for the highest authority at various junctures in his rather unusual career. And this was no minor peccadillo, but an informed and deliberate strategy of emotional rebellion that contributed to the pre- and post-Decembrist Russian milieu. Chaadaev's open display of contempt for authority marked a seminal emotional shift in Russian elite society, for it was a politically bold, even revolutionary affect in many respects in the 1820s. Notably, it also became a defining element of the symbolic sign Chaadaev and of the seminal literary characters based on him. So to turn to the body of my talk, I would say it's a commonplace in Russian culture to assert that Chaadaev is responsible for articulating, if not in fact creating, the paradox of modern Russian identity. In asserting Russia's exclusion from European history in his scandalous 1836 First Philosophical Letter, Chaadaev is credited with giving shape to the question of Russia's fate and with sparking the Slavophile Westernizer debate that so preoccupied 19th century national thought. Given how much ink has been spilled on Chaadaev and the, quote, question he posed of Russia's status between East and West, it's perhaps an even greater paradox that there has been no study devoted to his enormous, arguably foundational presence in 19th century Russian literature. As David Budgen memorably put it, the Russian literary canon is unimaginable without Chaadaev. There would be no Alexander Chatsky, protagonist of Griboyedov's Skoria at Uma, no Eugene Onegin, no Trinzinsky and Herzen's Notes of a Young Man, no Stepan Verkhovensky and Dostoevsky's Biesi, and no Andrei Versilov in Podrostok, to name some of the most visible examples of characters based, at least in part, on Chaadaev. Borrowing Yuri Oxman's mid-20th century term for such characters, I would stress that while the Chaadaeviets has been noted in passing, it has not been the subject of sustained scholarly attention, even though it's commonly acknowledged as an important source for the archetype of the infamous superfluous man. Given the prevalence of the Chaadaeviets, however, it's clear that Chaadaev himself is hardly a superfluous figure, but rather of critical importance to 19th century Russian literature. In the larger project that this paper comes from, I seek to answer how and why it was the case that one historical personage generated such a powerful literary presence. Why was Chaadaev, and here I mean both the man himself and the characters associated with him, so important to his peers and to later writers? What did his figure express about Russian experience? After all, Chaadaev did not take part in the Decembrist revolt, was not sent into exile, nor was he a great writer. He should, in some sense, be a footnote, and yet somehow he matters a great deal. In attempting to answer these questions, I consider the Chaadaev literary phenomenon from some different angles. One is a close look at Chaadaev's resonance with his peers, as well as with later writers and thinkers such as Herzen and Dostoevsky. What did these authors see in him and in the various literary representations of him? The second angle I employ is a consideration of the relationship between Chaadaev himself and his literary avatars. And here my focus is on how the process of literary characterization, from Pushkin's early poems addressed to Chaadaev in the 1810s to Mikhail Zagoskin's mocking 1835 play The Malcontents, Nedovolny, intersected with Chaadaev's real actions and behavior. This interplay between the historical person and his avatars poses intriguing questions about the role of celebrity or notoriety and representation on the formation of the self, questions which are as much a preoccupation in today's world as they were in the dawning age of celebrity. While the use of real personages as prototypes was a widespread practice in 19th century Russian literature, I don't believe that anyone produced or helped to produce as many characters as Chaadaev. And this is remarkable given that he did not carry out any conventionally significant actions beyond that of writing a set of controversial essays about national identity. More remarkable still, however, is the fact that literary characterization of Chaadaev began before those events of his biography occurred that would make him a figure of any importance. In this way, Chaadaev's story is marked by a highly unusual degree of push and pull between text and life. When writers such as Pushkin, Griboyev, and Dostoevsky engaged in an intertextual dialogue about Chaadaev, they also engaged with ongoing debates about the nature of Russian history and national consciousness. As I argue, one of the most salient features of the Chaadaev phenomenon is its resonance in regard to the nature of action, political or otherwise, that his persona and life story encapsulate. The figure of Chaadaev is controversial precisely because it's not clear how the main events of his biography should be understood. Was he a noble patriot who uttered an important wake-up call to his countrymen, or an impotent would-be Decembrist vainly seeking the public eye? While on the surface this interpretive debate might seem narrow, the questions it raises are fundamental. What constitutes dissent in a political system without a formal place for opposition or criticism? Can resistance exist in such a system? The issue of whether Chaadaev's public expression of criticism should be understood as a significant protest hinges on what is at heart a thorny debate over the extent to which words constitute action. While in my book I consider the big picture of Chaadaev and the Chaadaevsky, today I will take a close look at one of the seminal early events in Chaadaev's life that helped to establish the aura of his significance among his contemporaries. And this is his early retirement from military service in 1821, and his expression of what I argue was revolutionary sentiment in the form of contempt for authority. Comprising Chaadaev's first public or semi-public gesture, the event has always attracted attention. However, it's of greater insignificance than has been previously understood. Closer study reveals a number of important details in regard to an early 19th century context of, quote, radical political emotions, the wave of political rebellion occurring in Europe at the time, and the emergence of a defining characteristic of Chaadaev in the eyes of his contemporaries, his expression of scorn. Taken together, these different elements greatly expand our understanding of how Chaadaev and his contemporaries understood his behavior and why it was perceived as historically important. But before I jump into the context of 1820 to 21, I just wanted to briefly situate my work. And self-fashioning is obviously a very important theme in Russian literature and culture, and it's been the subject of extensive study, especially in relation to the Romantic period. And it, of course, plays a central role in Chaadaev's biography. So my aim here is not to recreate seminal work on this topic, but rather to expand the understanding of Chaadaev as a pivotal figure at the very nexus of this cultural practice. Chaadaev performed highly legible behavior according to a Romantic code in which nearly all aspects of life were understood to carry symbolic meaning, and in which individuals were expected to act in a manner consistent with this belief, from what they wore to their political positions. Members of the Russian educated elite were heavily influenced by literary models in their behavior. This real social behavior, in turn, served as the inspiration for literary characters. Chaadaev is recognized as playing a role in establishing these literary behavioral patterns, in part because he is credited with introducing Byronism to Russian society in the 1810s. Recent Russian scholars have built on Yuri Lotman's seminal work in this area to broaden his concept of literary behavior, литературное поведение, to encompass the study of personality and the history of emotions under what Andrei Zorin terms literary experience, литературное переживание, a defining element of Russian sentimentalism and romanticism. Zorin's work on Andrei Turgenev's diaries reveals the creation of a new personality in elite Russian society in this period, one who, quote, passionately believed that literary, aesthetic, and philosophical ideas borrowed from Western authors should define his personal life in its most intimate manifestations. This phenomenon existed across Europe to one degree or another, but it was heightened in the Russian environment. Works such as Ilya Vinitsky's recent study of the poet Vasily Zhukovsky show just how profoundly literary modeling could shape lives and behavior in this period. To date, however, I'm not aware of scholarship on how individuals might have responded not only to general literary models, but specifically to literary representations of themselves, as I consider to have been the case with Chaadaev. The display of certain kinds of feeling is integral to the concept of literary experience. Emotion and its expression acquired increasing importance in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Evincing the correct sentiment in the right proportion was as important as the display of reason and wit in Enlightenment Europe, and this was the case in Russia too, as recent work by, among others, Jan Plumper, Valeria Sobol, Mark Steinberg, and most recently Emily Wang shows. In Chaadaev's case, one particular emotion proved to be of seminal importance, but it's one that's been almost entirely overlooked in emotion scholarship, and that is contempt or disdain, a quality that came to be associated in a prominent and complex way with his persona. Today, I examine the event which made contempt into a, quote, sticky emotion for Chaadaev, to borrow Sarah Ahmed's term, and a critical part of the sign of Chaadaev in Russian culture, and I think consider why this emotion matters. So in the interest of time, I won't discuss Chaadaev's biography in detail, but I will note that his persona that developed from his early interest in Byron was distinct in Russian culture, and it was readily understood as something meant to be legible and consistent. Members of his social milieu often noted his theatrical mannerisms, his mask-like face, and his unusual style of speaking, silence punctuated by sudden, quote, inspired speech, all of which seemed contrived to make him appear touched. Contemporaries also frequently noted Chaadaev's meticulous dress and handsome appearance, as well as his egoism and vanity. Such comportment recalls the figure of a romantic prophet or genius, and Chaadaev certainly behaved in such a way as to suggest this image. We might, however, also read Chaadaev's manner through the lens of affect and emotions theory. Chaadaev enacted a memorable and identifiable affect of boredom, contempt, and superiority. While they seem at first glance little more than petty negative attributes, they were politically meaningful in early 19th century Russia, where subjects' emotional displays had been the target of legislation since the Catherinian period. Okay, so now just moving on to 1820 to 21, this is a pivotal year in Chaadaev's biography because it is at this point that his relatively unremarkable youth was transformed when his career underwent a sudden change from kind of regular advancement in the military ranks to early retirement around the time of the Semyonovsky mutiny. And I would note here that the ensuing scandal over Chaadaev's early retirement served as a spark for Griboyedov's Skoria at Uma, begun just a few months later in the fall of 1821. So in mid-October of 1820, the soldiers of the elite Semyonovsky regiment, led by their officers, mutinied against their commander, Colonel Schwartz, in response to his harsh policies. Authorities feared this was linked to a larger liberal conspiracy, although no evidence of such a plot was ever discovered. However, anxiety that the mutiny was the work of radical agitators was stoked by the contemporary political unrest in Spain, Naples, and elsewhere, and it was Alexander's initial assumption. In the weeks after the mutiny, Chaadaev was entrusted with the task of delivering the official report to Alexander I in Troppau, where the Congress of the Holy Alliance had convened in response to the wave of revolutionary unrest across Europe. In the normal course of things, Chaadaev should have received a significant promotion for delivering the report. By all accounts, he completed it so successfully that Alexander promised to reward him with promotion to the role of personal aide-de-camp. Yet, a couple of weeks after the meeting with Alexander, Chaadaev submitted a request for retirement. This action surprised and irritated the authorities. He was eventually allowed to retire in February of 1821, but without the promotion, a form of punishment. The punishment was not simply due to Chaadaev's request for retirement, however, but was also meted out in response to a dismissive letter about the promotion that Chaadaev sent to his aunt in early January of 1821, which, despite its private nature, was, as a matter of course, read by the censors and ultimately reported to Alexander. The episode I've just described would hardly seem to be the kind of event that comprises national history, yet Chaadaev's actions in 1820 to 21 are a key element of the narrative of pre-Decembrist Russia, and they've been a matter of intense speculation. Why did Chaadaev accept the mission when it was counter to Decembrist ideals? Why did he resign? Why was he punished? There have been a number of different explanations for Chaadaev's actions since the time of their occurrence. Early 20th century scholar Mikhail Gershenzon argues that Chaadaev's request to leave service was meant to restore his reputation with his liberal friends after what was, in their eyes, an unacceptable display of personal ambition. Gershenzon's explanation is informed by the accounts of Chaadaev's contemporaries that appeared after his death in the 1860s and 70s. These maintain that Chaadaev resigned because he wanted to restore his honor, though for reasons of censorship, these accounts could not mention his ties to Decembrist circles. These accounts assert that Chaadaev faced intense recrimination and vicious gossip about his acceptance of the Troppau mission upon his return to Petersburg. And this gossip included rumors that Chaadaev had outmaneuvered other more senior officers for the mission, that he was late to reach Troppau because of his obsessive toilet, and thus Alexander was publicly embarrassed when the Austrians knew about the Semyonovsky mutiny before he did. The gossip included stories that Chaadaev had been given secret instructions by his commanding officer, Vasilchikov, to present the affair in the worst possible light for the officers of the Semyonovsky regiment, many of whom were Chaadaev's friends and acquaintances. In the 20th century, Lotman argued that Chaadaev's seemingly contradictory actions, first seeking out the task of meeting with the Tsar, then rejecting the expected reward, were modeled on the literary example of the Marquis of Posa from Schiller's popular tale Don Carlos. Posa addresses the king with critical truth about the kingdom. His criticism is only valid because he refuses any reward. In a similar vein, Yuri Tinyanov proposed that Chaadaev undertook to speak with Alexander about the need to reform serfdom at Troppau, but that the conversation was not a success. Recent Chaadaev scholar Mikhail Velizhev cites Tinyanov and Lotman's explanations, but notes that it's difficult to evaluate what happened. However, borrowing A.L. Ospavat's term, he adds that it was from this point on that Chaadaev's, quote, negative reputation began to take shape as someone for whom it was necessary to oppose himself to ordinary mortals at all costs. Richard Tempest takes yet another view of the affair, arguing that Chaadaev carried out the mission with no ulterior motives. He requested retirement simply because this was something he had desired for a long time, but had not yet felt able to ask for until that point. Following Tempest, historian Raymond McNally similarly downplays the event, suggesting that Chaadaev simply wanted to retire. Important here, however, is the fact that the promotion was somewhat unusual. It was not for service, but instead a special mark of personal favor from the Tsar. By all accounts, Chaadaev was on friendly terms with Alexander, who had shown him special attention, and this makes it difficult to overlook the fact that requesting retirement was significant. While Gershenzon and Lotman's explanations are insightful and capture the broader zeitgeist of performative behavior in the 1820s, and Tempest offers many useful details, all of these scholars fail to properly consider a key element of this affair. They all note the fact that in the interval between the Troppau mission in October and the Tsar's acceptance of Chaadaev's request to retire in February, a letter Chaadaev sent to his aunt was read by the censors. The contents were deemed disturbing enough that they were communicated to Alexander himself, who thereafter granted the request of retirement but withheld the promotion. This letter offers crucial insight into the meaning of the Troppau events and the heated political context of 1820 to 21. So in early January of 1821, Chaadaev wrote to Anna Mikhailovna Shcherbatova as part of his routine correspondence with her. And the letter begins with Chaadaev informing her that he expects to receive his retirement soon. The tone of the letter, however, rapidly shifts from this neutral statement of fact to a demonstrative explanation of his presumably surprising request. And I will spare you all my butchering of French and read it in translation. He says, I found it more amusing, and I've highlighted the key lines here, to disdain this favor than to receive it. It amuses me to show my scorn to people who scorn everyone. If I've ever wished for something similar, it was only as one wishes for a pretty piece of furniture or an elegant carriage. In a word, as for a toy. Well, a toy for a toy. I prefer to see the vexation of arrogant stupidity. In principle, Chaadaev's words were directed at his immediate commander, Ilarion Vasilievich Vasilchikov, but most commentators have understood Chaadaev's remarks to be directed in a thinly veiled way at Alexander himself. The tone of the passage is jarring, both in regard to Chaadaev's usual style with his aunt and in terms of what was typically expected in discussion of senior officers. As I contend, this is not simply the statement of an arrogant young man mouthing off about his superiors. Chaadaev does not neutrally inform his aunt that he wishes to retire. He also does not proclaim that he's doing so as an act of sacrifice for a greater cause, though he does seem to suggest that others think he may be posing in such a way. And he also doesn't say anything about financial motivations. Rather, the reader's ear is particularly struck by his repetition of the claim that it amused him to decline the promotion, and that doing so would demonstrate his scorn for those who scorn everyone. In other words, he expresses explicit contempt for authority, and if that's understood here as the Tsar, then he expresses contempt for the one person, understood not only to be above all contempt, but also traditionally the one person entitled to display contempt to all others. Chaadaev rhetorically places himself as equal, even superior to the highest authority, and is able to display an emotion traditionally reserved for this highest authority. So while this describes Chaadaev's gesture in a nutshell, it's illuminating to unpack the context more fully in which it occurred. This context includes late 18th and early 19th century ideas about language and action, the understanding of emotion, and particularly of revolutionary feelings associated with the American context, as well as the momentous historical period of 1818 to 1820, which saw significant political unrest across Europe and South America aimed at establishing constitutional rule. It also reveals important aspects of Russian liberal elite sentiment about Alexander and changing ideas about the monarch. So to begin with language, I would note that there was an intense preoccupation during the Romantic period with the power of utterance to affect socio-political relations. Over the course of his career, Chaadaev used forms such as the personal letter or a journal article to issue politicized statements that were shocking in their departure from established norms of deference or restraint. Chaadaev's actions maintained a delicate balance in which he operated within established genres that were in theory open, but in practice were restricted by censorship. Within these generic parameters, he stated opinions and feelings that were not supposed to be expressed, such as criticism of his superiors or, in the first philosophical letter, of Russia itself. One aspect of the meaning of these actions for Chaadaev's contemporaries becomes more clear when we consider them through the prism of what Angela Esterhammer calls the romantic performative, or the way in which romantic writers and thinkers understood language. As Esterhammer shows, romantic linguistic philosophy prefigured aspects of 20th century speech act theory in a number of ways, most importantly in the reception of utterance as a form of action, an understanding, quote, so pervasive in such a wide range of late 18th and early 19th century writing that it needs to be identified as the prevailing way of thinking and using language during this period. Viewing Chaadaev's utterances within a context in which they were both intended and received as actions enriches our understanding of him and complements the literary modeling that scholars like Lotman and Zorin have discussed. So to explore this idea more fully, I would note that romantic writers and thinkers understood something to happen when words were spoken or written. Quote, verbal utterances have an effect on the addressee, the speaker, and the speech situation that needs to be described, not just in terms of rhetoric or persuasion, but as the actual founding of the subject positions of speaker and hearer, the establishment of their relationships to one another and to the external world. Utterances perform actions rather than describing the world. So as I will discuss, it's precisely this understanding that informs Chaadaev's gestures. In the case of the letter to his aunt, and uttering an opinion about authority, he establishes himself as an equal in relation to this authority. The very utterance of the opinion validates the opinion itself. In this vein, individual words can be understood in performative terms to, quote, establish the relationship between speaker and the world, altering both these terms in the process. Romantic thinkers ascribe to utterance the power to change political reality, to bring the ideas they described into being. And such thought was informed in part by philosophical ideas expressed in Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, but also, and perhaps even more prominently, by the late 18th century revolutionary context. For example, the French Revolution is widely understood to have been as much a linguistic event as a physical and political one. Thus, Chaadaev's statement that he's amused by scorning those who scorn everyone might be understood as a radical declaration of equality, even of superiority, and the very act of his declaration has the potential to make it so, to make him the one who scorns. Moreover, as scholars have noted, a new definition of citizen emerged after the American and French revolutions as, quote, one whose right to speak is equal to that of others in society. By speaking as an equal, Chaadaev becomes that equal, and perhaps even more radically for a Russian subject, becomes a citizen, one who has the right to speak. And I dwell on this point to underscore how complex and politically weighted this seemingly offhand statement in a personal letter is. It threatens to disrupt the political order, even if only in a small or incremental way. And as I will show, it recalls the recent revolutionary context, as well as the constitutional uprisings across Europe in the 1810s. Moreover, in 1821 and later in 1836, Chaadaev's utterances were treated by the authorities as actionable offenses, revealing the extent to which this was a period in which speech could be construed as disruption to the social and political order. The letter's content is significant in another way, however. Chaadaev's expression of contempt belongs within an important emotional context that informed the revolutionary era. In the American context, the colonists' ire was particularly provoked by a perceived tone of disrespect from King George III and Parliament. As Nicole Eustace shows, what had once been an accepted marker of royal power in relation to the ruled, contempt, had come to be experienced as a matter of offense by this period. Anger, and particularly the variant of disdain or the explicit show of disrespect, has received less attention within research on the history of emotions, a somewhat surprising state of affairs given the political, even radical significance of certain forms of anger. This was a time in which a demonstration of disdain for authority and concomitant lack of fear or refusal to perform subservience were potent gestures. As Alexander Martin has noted, the Revolutionary era was marked by important shifts in popular response to the figure of the monarch across Europe and in America. Traditionally viewed as a father with unchallengeable and absolute authority over his subjects, the ruler in this period came to be increasingly subject to critical attitudes toward paternal authoritarianism, while, quote, the patriarchal ideology that undergirded the old regime began to give way, something that played an important role in the lead-up to both the American and French revolutions. This shift in attitude gave rise to increasing intolerance of perceived monarchical display of disdain or indifference, especially on the part of elites. In short, the Enlightenment values that emphasize the formation of a public sphere in which, quote, people could speak to each other freely and equally across class barriers came into conflict with the older notion of publicness that had stressed the ceremonial representation and ritualized acting out of the old regime's ideal of absolutist and corporatist hierarchy. As Stanislav Tarasov describes, a process of ever-increasing humanization or desacralization of the monarch took place from the 18th century on, in which the figure of the monarch came to be evaluated in terms of Enlightenment notions of moral virtues and sentiments, and could be found lacking on these fronts. Loyalty to the monarch was increasingly replaced by loyalty to the concepts of the nation, the fatherland, and the people. As Eustace describes in relation to 18th century values in colonial America and elsewhere, emotion was considered as important as reason in the understanding of political philosophy and power relations. Within this context, expressions of emotion constituted declarations of status. That is, certain people were permitted to express certain feelings. For example, the expression of resentment was a marker of elite status that was tied to manliness, nobility, and importantly, honor, while giving way to feelings of rage or fury was considered a marker of low status and an indicator of a lack of mastery of one's emotions. In this period, the capacity for emotion itself came to be closely linked to the idea of passion for liberty and to a sense of entitlement to legal standing as a free person. So tautologically, the possession of a passion for liberty was regarded as the most important indicator of one's worthiness for political liberty. And I quote here, for American revolutionaries, connections between emotional sensitivity and natural liberty could not have been clearer. Those whose hearts and bosoms harbored strong feelings and sensations of love of their country and love of justice could lay easy claim to the blessings of liberty, for spirit fostered the civic virtue that in turn validated claims to free citizenship. And Eustace describes the widely shared 18th century emphasis on the importance of the Aristotelian notion of spirit or thumos. Those individuals or groups who did not display spirit were understood to be naturally, quote, slavish, and hence undeserving where liberty was concerned, while those who demonstrated spirit or passion for liberty, in so doing, demonstrated their very worthiness for that state. These ideas stemmed from the broader Enlightenment context in which thinkers such as Adam Smith argued that emotion was the wellspring of virtue. This emphasis on sentiment and its display made expression of feeling a powerful tool for either maintaining the status quo or upending it. Certain ways of expressing emotion could represent unmistakable stands of resistance. So thus, lively display of feeling, and especially of anger in the form of resentment of inappropriate treatment, especially contempt, was a practice situated in a revolutionary context. As William Kerrigan describes in his brief examination of scorn, the feeling can come in two varieties: contempt that stems from a difference in actual status, such as class hierarchy, and scorn that derives from a perception of metaphorical nobility, or is based on intellectual, moral, or spiritual terms. Kerrigan argues that in early 19th century America, the latter form of scorn came from, quote, the self-esteem of a new individualism based on merit and aspiration rather than class pride. This expression of scorn is, quote, the signal emotion of an idealism that responds to a corrupt world with a punishing, high-minded disdain. More broadly, it emerges from an Enlightenment context of developing ideas of equality, at least for elites, in relation to state authority. The sentiment of scorn as a form of moral or idealistic display plays a key role in rhetoric from the American Revolution, as evidenced in the colonial poet Philippe Freneau's verse, Reflections on the Mutability of Things. As Kerrigan suggests, these lines might be said to define, quote, the eternal structure of the American Revolution. Other important instances of such rhetoric can be found in works such as Thomas Paine's famous revolutionary pamphlet from 1776, Common Sense. And similarly, the Reverend John Witherspoon produced an important public example of repudiation of perceived monarchical disdain in a May 1776 sermon when he criticized George III for displaying, quote, the resentment of a haughty monarch, and asserted that, quote, the ineffable disdain expressed by one fellow subject in saying that he would not hearken to America till she was at his feet has armed more men and inspired more deadly rage than could have been done by laying waste a whole province with fire and sword. In American Revolutionary era rhetoric, at least, the act of repaying scorn with scorn is marked as the genesis of liberty. Display of disdain for authority, and specifically for the monarch, acts as an assertion of an independent, non-submissive self. Elite contempt for authority, then, was a deeply meaningful gesture, based as it was on the conviction of one's own merits as an individual, and the conviction that these merits were under constraint by the ruler of the state. So to return to Chaadaev, there are several ways in which this American revolutionary context is relevant. For one, as Martin describes, educated Russians' conception of progress shifted over the course of the 18th century from an association with the radical authoritarian transformations enacted by Peter I to one inspired by social ideas of natural law and equality. For many, such ideals were stymied by the realities of serfdom and despotism. Mark Reif notes that the conflict between Enlightenment ideals of equality and, quote, the traditional Russian insistence on complete submission and obedience to authority, unquote, was a motivating one for the generation that coincided with Alexander's ascent to the throne. For those born around the turn of the century, their early training in unconditional loyalty to the crown and state came to be, quote, intolerable because of the obsequious obedience to tyrannical authority that it entailed. As a result, young members of the elite became estranged from the imperial regime. And this estrangement was amplified by Alexander's shift in tone and practice in the 1810s. Initially appearing to support reform, he stepped back from such measures after 1815 and the defeat of Napoleon. Around this time, those who were particularly disillusioned with Alexander founded the secret societies that would become the Decembrist circles. These young elites were interested in the American system of government, and many saw it as a model for Russia going forward. They read widely on American history and politics and felt that a constitution of some form was necessary for Russia. And Alexander famously himself was deeply schooled in the ideas associated with the American Revolution by his Swiss tutor, La Harpe. Importantly, there was also a great deal of resentment of Alexander on the part of the Decembrists and what I might call the Decembrist adjacent liberal elites for what they perceived as his marked contempt for them in personal terms and for Russia. These feelings were especially pronounced in 1820 when Chaadaev wrote his letter. As Stanislav Tarasov details, Alexander's disregard of Russia was a major point of offense for liberal officers who felt that he spoke, quote, with contempt about Russian officers and the Russian people in general while abroad, and specifically at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. They also perceived the fact that Alexander was mostly abroad during this period as neglect of his national duties and an abandonment of his country. Liberal elites even felt that Alexander had become a traitor and that his behavior was dishonorable. Particularly offensive for members of the secret societies was Alexander's 1818 speech to the Polish Sejm, where he appeared to promise Russian constitutional reform as well as emancipation for the serfs, but nothing came of these statements. At the time, Decembrists expressed mixed feelings. Hope for a Russian constitution mingled with anger that one had been given to Poland first. Quote, most of the nobility expressed bitter feelings and saw a clear betrayal of national interest in his speech. In this period, many of the future Decembrists, and I should note that Chaadaev belonged to the Northern Society at least up until 1821-23. In this period, many of the future Decembrists felt personally dishonored by Alexander as well. For example, Ivan Yakushkin described in his diary the indignation felt throughout the army in response to an incident in which Alexander demoted officers for insolence, despite the fact that this was a common punishment. Yakushkin also commented that Alexander's statements abroad expressed clear contempt for Russians. As Tarasov discusses, Alexander came to seem like a, quote, bad friend who had violated the promise of a friendship among equals. That this was no laughing matter is clear from the numerous expressions of regicidal ideas and plans throughout the 1815 to 25 period. Perhaps of particular relevance to Chaadaev's situation, it's worth noting that even Alexander's failure to return to Russia in the immediate aftermath of the Semyonovsky mutiny sparked resentment and was perceived as disrespectful. When the perception of Alexander as contemptuous is added into the broader revolutionary era context, what was initially an awkward-sounding claim in Chaadaev's letter becomes powerful in new ways, and we begin to be able to construct more fully what it must have meant to contemporaries, the Tsar included. It's easy to see why people understood Chaadaev's remark that it amused him to scorn those who scorn everyone, to be aimed at Alexander himself. Scorn for a ruler who scorns everyone is a sentiment that evokes the demands of the American colonists for political liberty. Further, it is itself understood as a linguistic action that expresses the speaker's worthiness of that liberty. It's a display of thumos, or spirit, that establishes his equality with the Tsar. Chaadaev's comments are also a reminder to Alexander and others of what the expression of unchecked royal condescension could lead to. And it bears noting that one of the factors ultimately enabling American colonists to band together in rebellion was the public sharing of passions in newspapers, poetry, etc. And the common emotion of resentment was a binding force that helped lead to revolution, for the colonists felt that, quote, the passions preceded, indeed produced action. Chaadaev's semi-public display of feeling, then, might be understood on some level as meant to inspire similar emotion in others. As Emily Wang has shown in her work on the Decembrists and the display of civic virtue, poet Kondratij Ryleyev consciously attempted to inspire virtuous political feelings in others with his verse. The preceding discussion suggests that we should understand Chaadaev's performance of contempt as an entirely legible and valid action, both to his peers and to Alexander. Without this context, his letter remains provocative yet incomprehensible. With it, we began to understand why Chaadaev's act of emotional rebellion was so important in his time and place. In conclusion, while I do not delve into some of the more abstract elements of the emotion of contempt today, I would like to note that Chaadaev is perhaps the only member of the Decembrist circles to use the power of this negative feeling to express something about the constrained socio-political status of the elite Russian subject, or to diagnose powerlessness and obstruction. From this time on, the affect of contempt became a sticky attribute for him, one that represented a knot of tension and an interpretive ambiguity. How politically important is contempt? What should we make of the troublingly negative aspects of this emotional state? This represented a thorny dilemma for Chaadaev's contemporaries and after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ingrid. I'm trying to make myself visible. Thank you so much, Ingrid, for that fascinating and also weirdly timely talk. Really interesting. And now we'll turn to our собеседник Ekaterina Lyamina. Ekaterina, thank you.
Good evening, and I'm grateful for your invitation and the chance to be the part of this important discussion. I also feel very enthusiastic about the fact that Chaadaev returns in the field of Russian studies as a celebrity. I'm referring to Ingrid's talk, of course, but also to Mikhail Velizhev's recent book on Chaadaev's ideal. I'm also certain that Chaadaev would be extremely pleased to know about these current studies and the new wave of interest we are paying him and his legacy. First, I would like to draw out significant themes of the paper presented today. In my opinion, the presence of Chaadaev's personality and biography and philosophy, maybe also, in many texts of Russian literary canon during the 19th century is a subject of great importance and productivity. There are not many persons in the Russian history of the 19th century who, not being writers or journalists or politicians, are fathers of that number of literary characters. Of course, neither Chatsky nor Onegin are pure and strict representations of Chaadaev. However, he left a great a generation, many generations of literary characters. Also, it is necessary in each case to define the level of Chaadaevian influence. And I think Ingrid, working on her book, developed a methodology for that. I also think that if we analyze Chaadaev's conduct and self-fashioning, 2 points from discussed in Ingrid's presentations are really important. First, performative affirmation of equality, maybe even égalité, with the monarch and even superiority above over him. And also contextualization of contempt as a republican emotion. These are very rich points for further development, and I expect Ingrid's book with enthusiasm. As well as Ingrid's deep, profound remark about a generation of Russian nobility born in the end of 18th, first years of 19th centuries, as of persons who became able to regard the emperor as a citizen, who can be decent or not decent, bad or good. And I also think that during the reign of Nicholas I, this model became ancient and out of fashion, out of mode. And this was the point of conflict also of Chaadaev with the society and with the time in which he lived the second half of his life. In connection with that, I presume that maybe we should think of Chaadaev not only as of, if we take a popular mot of Russian historical studies, Decembrist without December, but also of Decemberists before and after December. Before, Ingrid demonstrated well that this letter to his aunt represented a highly semiotical act in Lotman understanding of semiotics. Manifestation of an emotion normally banned from relationship monarch and his subject. As of after December, I'm strongly inclined to think that all events of Moscow autumn of 1836, publication of the first philosophical letter in Telescope magazine and so on, also represented a semiotic act, not only a statement made in the area of philosophy or history. Was that also the act of contempt, of rationally chosen madness, of civilian suicide, sort of the death of Seneca, etc.? It is a matter of further analysis, I think. And in conclusion, a question to Ingrid, a question that constantly bothers me during many years. Why Chaadaev was so certain that these letters sent to his aunt in Russia would have been opened, read, and reported to the Tsar? What if this letter was not illustrated? Would all this case have taken another way? What do you think? And thank you very much for your great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ekaterina, for those remarks. First, I'll turn to Ingrid and see if you'd like to respond a bit, and then we'll open the floor because I'm sure we'll have many questions. Ingrid.
Oh, thank you so much, Ekaterina. It's really helpful and interesting to hear always when someone pulls together the main points of what you're doing. And thank you, Anne. So maybe I would just respond to your question at the end, which is extremely interesting. Because I think it's really inherent to the whole project of the letter itself is that it only hits its mark because Chaadaev does assume it will be read. But we know that it was common practice that personal correspondence was read, especially officers writing to each other, right? But then in this case that he's writing to this older family member, an older woman who's not politically active, it's sort of a question like, why would this necessarily cross the desk of the censors and then be passed up the line? And I guess sort of like two answers to that. It does get passed up the line because it's so shocking, right? It's such a kind of offensive statement that it has to be delivered to its addressee. But I also think there's something incredibly contemptuous about writing your contempt for the monarch in the letter to your aged maiden aunt out in the countryside, right? Like, what could be more dismissive than that? He's not writing to another member of an elite secret society. He's writing to someone who's totally not political, and he's sort of demonstrating that behind closed doors, he's not the cheerful, loyal subject at all. And in fact, he speaks like just with this sort of really dismissive language of the monarch, even in the most intimate, like casual kinds of interactions. So I think, yes, if it had not been read, the whole thing would have fallen flat and we wouldn't have the Chaadaev that we have today, I don't think. But since I think he could assume it would be read, he really, really uses tools at his disposal in a very effective way. And I think that's one of the things that's really been like less understood about him and about the important. Everyone realizes that letter is somehow important, but it's like, but why? Why does it matter so much? And it's the contents of the letter, it's the tone of the letter, and then it's the act of this personal letter to your old aunt itself. So hopefully that kind of answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Great. Oh, I see a hand from Margaret. Shamu.
So this is maybe a little bit tangential to your really fascinating topic. I just thought your argument was very strong and just terrific. And I hope that other people have something maybe more pertinent to the argument. But I was just wondering about this, his early retirement. From my area of study as an art historian, I found that it wasn't, I mean, the officer artists that we have, like Pavel Fedotov, they take early retirement. And I was just wondering how common is it to do this early retirement? In my world, I see it it feels like a lot, or people who become interested in the arts as a patron, or I just see a lot of early retirement. And just could you say a few more words about that?
Sure. Thank you, Margaret. And I don't want to say that Chaadaev's the only person who takes early retirement. That is definitely, you're right. It's a very widespread practice and it's expensive to remain as an officer in military service. Chaadaev always had money problems. So sort of like behind the scenes, there are some other reasons that are probably playing into his request. But it's the way in which he does it, right? Rather than just asking for it and sort of quietly leaving the scene, he really uses it as an opportunity. And I think the fact that he had met with Alexander personally in Troppau, that he had a kind of friendship with him, and then immediately after that requests this retirement, that's the timing of it is what makes it kind of an offensive gesture toward authority. But you're absolutely right that officers were very often like actually somewhat ready to take retirement if they could for other interests and just to get out of the financial obligation.
I see. That makes it really, it was really clear in your talk that the timing issue and the how offensive it was. I just had that side question. Thank you so much.
Sure, yeah.
Great. I see a hand from Hildy Hogenboom.
This was fascinating. Thank you so much, Ingrid. And I'm so eager to read your book. I love how you put the political and the literary and the philosophical together. This is a fabulous approach. And so I just have a couple of quick questions. I'm going to assume that since his aunt is Shcherbakova, that she's actually someone important from an important family. So I'd be curious to know more about that. And then, of course, the fact that the correspondence and the philosophical letters are in French. And I'm sure there's a whole big idea behind that, too. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Hildy. Really interesting questions. And absolutely, Shcherbakova is important, right? So Chaadaev's maternal grandfather was Mikhail Shcherbakov, the 18th century figure who was critical of Catherine and of the Russian system, right? And he had written some essay or text kind of criticizing corruption in Russian political sector and criticizing the structure of autocracy. So there was a real family tradition of kind of political resistance, political criticism. So that's important. it also mentions almost like kind of a little footnote, but Chaadaev's father, who died when he was really young, had written a play. It was not published, but it was a play mocking a corrupt official, for which he got into trouble, and the official had every copy of the play destroyed, or almost every single one. But so there was a real family legacy for Chaadaev of this kind of using texts to express political criticism, political opposition, even to some extent. So is really very present there. And I think it's absolutely crucial to why Chaadaev might have seen himself as someone who should carry on that kind of legacy and be engaged in it. And then your second question about the philosophical letters, of course, it's incredibly important that they're written in French. I think that Ekaterina sort of touched on this as well. I would see, especially the publication of the first philosophical letter, the one that caused the scandal, as in a way very much in keeping with the letter to his aunt. I mean, it's more formal and it's really an essay about history and with ideas, but it's also this kind of shocking thing that appears in the journal. Everyone expects it will just kind of be in line with everything else. And then there it is on the scene, and it's making this really explicit criticism, even condemnation of Russian identity and Russian history. This is just not said out loud. And suddenly Chaadaev is saying it out loud. So I think that we should see it again as a kind of like using tools that are available to him, which are somewhat limited or constrained, to actually make a statement about those constraints. I mean, like, so you get declared insane for writing an essay, you have your promotion denied because you wrote a letter to your aunt. I mean, these things really expose how narrow the political sector is for someone like Chaadaev. So hopefully I'm answering your question there, but I think the French is part of the statement. And in addition to maybe emotional affect, we could also think about the tone of these texts. Something like the philosophical letter is just, it's almost like it's written in the tone of the scornful man, right? Like this is the scornful voice of the first letter in its fuller development. I would even argue that he almost, that first philosophical essay, it's like it's written in the voice of the Chaadaev-yets. Like there have already been Chaadaev-tsi, we have Onegin, we have Chatsky, and Chaadaev is almost like he takes on the voice he is presumed to have in these characterizations of him and produces his own text as that character. So that's one of the things I'm thinking about and looking at in my chapter on 1836. Hopefully that helps to answer your questions.
That's fascinating. Thank you very much. We have two questions lined up. First, Alexander Mikhailovich, and then Chloe Kitzinger. Alexander. Oh, unmute Alexander, please. Let's see, unmute. One of our, yes.
Hello. Yes, Ingrid, you already in some ways anticipated my question with the comparisons with the first philosophical letter. That's precisely the question I had in mind, which was the extent to which, the parallels between the two texts. Another aspect of the two letters that is interesting is that they're both addressed to a female correspondent or interlocutor. And I was given, however, the ambiguity of the first philosophical letter, which of course is a text that in many ways serves as a point of departure both for 19th century Westernism and for Slavophilism. How do you see expressed rhetorically or in some other manner through indirection the sticky emotion of scorn or contempt in that particular text, because it seems to be more mediated? Thank you.
Thank you, Alexander. Also an excellent question. And I think here it's a little bit like the gesture of speaking dismissively of the Tsar in the letter to your aunt, writing this really dismissive and we might say kind of almost contemptuous take on Russian history in the first letter, philosophical letter. Is the continuation of this act, of this tone. I think that, as you point out, right, the contents of the first philosophical letter, it's a little bit tricky interpreting them, like whether we're meant to take them at face value or whether this is a Chaadaev-yet speaking, and Chaadaev in writing in that voice is ironically commenting on this character of the Chaadaev-yets, is sort of another maybe level or question there. So I think he certainly, I do see them as in a continuum, and that this first philosophical letter is a kind of another contemptuous act, like to just say, like, okay, here we are in Nikolaev in Russia, and I just think this history is nothing, right? That there's nothing there of any value. That's what causes such sort of sharp reaction on the part of authorities. And then we see, they kind of, in a sense, fall into his trap. I think that Alexander he just takes away the promotion, but he doesn't publicly reveal annoyance with Chaadaev. So Chaadaev's contempt doesn't quite hit its mark in that sense. If you show contempt to someone and they just ignore it, then it doesn't really work. If you show contempt to someone and they're kind of clearly upset by it, you show that it's worked. And so Nicholas, in a sense, by declaring him insane and like confining him to house arrest and all this stuff, he actually kind of walks right into in a sense, the emotional trap of that by showing how much the letter seems to sting or to kind of hit its mark. Hopefully I'm answering your question there.
Great, thank you. We have a question from Chloe Kitzinger, who needs to be unmuted, please. And then in the chat, there's a follow-up, a question from Hildy. So, Chloe.
Thank you. And thanks so much, Ingrid. I learned a lot from your talk and from this discussion. I just wanted to ask a little bit more. I was really struck by the fact that you placed Chaadaev both in the context of the American Revolution and Byron. Just because for me, those are two sort of, I guess, historical stances or archetypes or positions that I've never really thought to put together before. And when I think about the later superfluous man type, it does seem specifically like someone who is scornful but does not act, right? Because he putatively has no sphere in which to act. And so the scorn almost becomes a kind of compounding of the political impotence, right? Or the political sort of aporia that he's in. And I was wondering where you would place these kind of indirect and tricky political actions of Chaadaev and rhetorical actions on that spectrum between kind of performing scorn and therefore being kind of disarmed in a way, in that kind of classic way of the superfluous man, and performing scorn as this kind of brave revolutionary political action, as I think you also are implying.
Thank you, Chloe. And I think this is getting at the heart of some of what I'm working on in the book. So let me, going back to American Revolution and Byron. Yeah, we don't normally think of them in the same sentence, right? But we know that the Decembrists were incredibly interested in the American Revolution, and that was the model maybe they were looking to more than the French Revolution. So they were very well versed in information about the revolution and about the Constitution. There were even some kind of minor scandals around the same time as 1820-21, where there was like a journal where they had published, the editor, I forget his name, had published a summary from the American Congress, right, from that year or the year before, like summary of their actions and political acts and discussions, and the journal was closed down for that. But this was in like 1820, so there's a lot of focus on America as a model. But then there's also Byron coming in the early 19th century, who's like really the persona that is so important. I think for Chaadaev, I would actually throw another figure in here as maybe even equally important to Byron, and that's Beau Brummel, the dandy in London society, who was famous for being really, really rude to George III, right? He called him his fat friend or something like that at one point, which didn't go over very well. But so there is a model where this kind of elite dandy ironic figure also performs contempt for everyone, including the monarch, but it's not just sort of social snobbery, it's also very politicized, because this can only happen in a situation where mutual contempt can be exchanged. And then, some of the people, there are very few people who have written on contempt, but one of the interesting scholars who does, William Miller, he talks about how that's really fundamental to a democratic project. It's not really these positive things so much as the ability to exchange mutual contempt, that the low can show up for the high and vice versa. So hopefully that helps us to think about why would we have like sort of Byron and, American constitutional revolutionary recent experience combined for a figure like Chaadaev. And then this question, I think if I understood you correctly, right, this performance of scorn as some kind of impotent gesture versus performance of scorn as actually courageous act. This is like really the interpretive ambiguity around Chaadaev that surrounds him perpetually from this time on. Contempt is not a feeling we usually think positively about. I mean, this is a petty feeling, and most of the time we would see it as something that maybe shouldn't be expressed. However, it's like almost in this one specific kind of early 19th century context in which contempt for the monarch becomes something politically valuable and courageous, but then it crashes into sort of contempt in general, which is something we don't really like. Like you're usually, when you express contempt for something, you kind of feel bad about it at the same time, right? Or if it happens to you, that's not a pleasant feeling. So I think that this is where you kind of look at something like an Onegin or a Chatsky, and Yekaterina is completely right. They're not completely based on Chaadaev. They're not direct representations of him, but it's the affect of contempt that really matters in these characters. And they're both really sort of emotionally inscrutable characters. And part of it is because, like, how do we as Russian readers in the 19th century, how should we respond to this affect? Is this brave, or is it just actually kind of awful and dark and really petty emotion? So I think it's like hard for me to give you like an explicit answer, because I think it's actually the really interesting question that a lot of this hinges around. So
thank you for that extremely interesting answer. And I'm going to take, I'm just going to make one little side comment, and then we'll go to Christy Monet and then back to Hildy Hugenboom, which is I'm fascinated by that you bring up Beau Brummel, and Dan Diaz. And because one of the things that's fascinating about Brummel is that I think he was of lower class origins, right?
Yeah.
So this was 100% performance, and specifically performance to clothing. And connecting that with Chaadaev's toilette and with his mask-like face, the sort of embrace of performance as performance that then allows you to express things that couldn't be expressed otherwise, I find really, really interesting across cultures, actually. So thank you for that. And now I will go to Christy Monet, who says, "Hi, Ingrid, thank you so much for your presentation. I wanted to ask what your thoughts are on Chaadaev's apology and how that may or may not be relevant to your discussion of romantic shaping of self-image and performance of scorn as revolutionary affect."
Thank you, Christy. Really interesting question. I think apology is a kind of a tricky document in some ways. And for those of you who might not be as familiar, this is what Chaadaev writes after getting in trouble for the first philosophical essay, The Apology of a Madman. Right? So there's actually a little bit of, I think, that scorn just there in the title of the letter, or some kind of ironic, maybe contempt in response to the punishment. I will say that I think Chaadaev, the experience of the punishment, of being declared insane and the house arrest for a year, one of the things I realized in recent research is that it seems to have had more of an effect on him than we might have expected. So, for example, he kind of denounced actually the woman he had addressed the philosophical letter to, because she, he said, "Oh, it wasn't me. I didn't have any influence on her. She's just kind of complaining about the political situation in Russia on her own." Some things like that, or like when Herzen wrote about him, and he preemptively wrote to the authorities saying, "I don't know where Herzen's getting this idea about me. I'm not a rebel. I don't want to have anything to do with it." So there's some slightly kind of uncomfortable things with Chaadaev later, after 1836, where I think he's maybe struggling with actually dealing with the consequences of what happened to him. And I think we could see the apology as like a little bit bitter, tongue-in-cheek sort of title, but he's also trying to get his main ideas out there, which he wasn't able to express in the first philosophical letter. Again, I think it's really confusing when we think about, like, why did he think he would be able to publish something like the first philosophical letter, and that then he would be allowed to publish the rest of what he had written. That's sort of a mystery. It's clear he really wanted to publish it. He was working in the summer of 1836 with Nadeždin to have his stuff published in the Telescope. But what he and Nadeždin thought would happen once it was published, is not clear to me. So the fact that Chaadaev was maybe a bit surprised at the level of the response, or maybe really thought he would have a chance to express himself more fully, I think that is kind of something that we will never know for sure, but is a really interesting question.
Thank you. And I'm going back to Hildy's question, which is in the chat. What's the significance of Pushkin, Griboyedov, Tolstoy, and others depicting Chaadaev's avatar as not serving at all?
Interesting question. Yeah, well, I think that's a bit of a comment on his retirement and the fact that he makes retirement into a political gesture. So, and then we know, like Chatsky, right? This is also some sort of political gesture that he refuses to serve or is too disdainful to serve in this corrupt environment. And I think we see that again, with Tolstoy as well. So this is maybe kind of the literary version of that retirement. Rather than rewriting that story, you just have your character refuse to take part at all. And it is a kind of refusenick position.
Thank you. Can I ask a question that it comes just entirely out of ignorance? Since this kind of performance of contempt and what you've identified as its specific kind of political valence at this moment seems to be quite specific to an upper level, right? And I don't mean just upper level in terms of not peasants. I mean upper level even within the upper levels, right? Do we have examples of like moments where we can see when this understanding of contempt and it's what it implies kind of politically comes into conflict with other understandings of contempt? Maybe other noblemen who really don't get the message at all and don't understand what this expression is?
That's an interesting question. I mean, and I might have to think about that a little bit. So like, if I understand your question, right, it's that some people don't understand kind of the political valence of it.
I would assume, I don't know. I would assume that you have to learn this.
You have to learn it, and you have to be really well read, right? You have to know exactly what the context is in which this makes sense.
Right.
And it is a small audience that's going to get that, I would guess. I think probably most, I mean, and we know like most Russian officers at this time are not members of the Decembrists or sort of Decembrist, pre-Decembrist groups, though there are some who might share some of those liberal sentiments. So I think part of it would be, whether you're kind of versed or schooled in this context. And another part of it would be like, just in general, how you feel about the monarch, right? So some people who are more loyal and stuff like that would find his display extremely offensive, but Chaadaev's display, right? And they would consider that he deserved to be punished for this insolence. But of course, it's interesting to me, and I have to do a little more research into this, but there seems to have been like a fair amount of legislation against insolence, like derizost, right, in this period, which makes me think that there's also a lot of demonstration of insolence going on toward authority. And it's like under Nicholas, in particular, you get this pretty harsh legislation against it. So it suggests that maybe there's a broader understanding that is shared with Chaadaev about this.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point about insolence, and when it becomes necessary to sort of police those expressions of emotions, very present in American political life right now.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Things that can be said or not said because somebody might feel bad or not bad. It's really interesting, and I think the derizost seems like a perfect place to kind of zero in on it. So thank you very much for that.
And sorry, I do just see that Christie's comment, and I want to say you're absolutely right. Yes, Chatsky has served, and we are never told exactly why he quit the service. There's some sort of scandal in Wolfenwit and Kuriatuma, but so in a way, maybe we read that as more closely Chaadaev, and that he's quit the service, and then the debate is whether he would come back. And also Chaadaev himself in the 1830s did try to return to service, but it was a resounding rejection from Nicholas at that point. So.
Do we have other questions? I would welcome questions from our graduate students too. I've seen a couple here who I know are thinking about Chaadaev these days, but maybe they're shy. Yeah, this makes, I'm actually teaching Chaadaev next week, and
Oh, wow.
this is bracing. This is very exciting to think about it in new terms. I really had not thought about him very much in terms of emotions and contempt. So thank you.
Oh, well, that's exciting that you're teaching him. I've
I-
always shied away from it a bit. but-
Well, you know, I mean, and then this is a sort of pedagogical side note, but the first time I took a Russian literature survey, you know, many years ago as a sort of special student at UCSD, the class started with Chaadaev, and
Wow.
I was completely blown away by the text. It's also somewhat distorting, right? You read that, if that's sort of your inaugural text, and we're doing Vietnamese first, so we're not allowed I'm not allowed Chaadaev to like sort of set the whole tone. But you know, it's so powerful. It asks certain questions and not other questions, and it poses them so starkly that it kind of can throw other things into confusion. But I love the text so much, and I'm teaching it along with a couple of different things with Kireevsky and the Dostoevsky's Pushkin speech.
Mhm.
So we'll see how it
Oh,
goes.
that's great. Well, I'm glad to hear someone else say they love the philosophical
Oh, I
book,
love
because I
it.
always loved it too, but I feel like people often think of it as some sort of horrible rag or something, you know. But anyway, so I share your affection for it. That's really interesting. Yeah. Oh, and thank you, Yekaterina. I see your comment. And yes, I do know that he was trying to publish them in France. And yeah, he was
Yeah.
very determined to get it out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The problem I've had with teaching it is having to tell students over and over again, remember, it's not the truth.
Yeah.
I mean, we're dealing with a performance here that has
Right.
certain goals. It's not that Russia has no history.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
they're naive, you know, these are undergraduates, but it's actually useful to have to start with that clarification, right?
Yeah, actually it is. It gives you a lot of room for talking points. So
Right.
yeah, absolutely. So maybe I would just throw in one other thing, just apropos of Yekaterina's comment about Chaadaev trying to get the letter published in the 1830s. So he makes some attempts, right? But one of the things I'm really interested in 1836 is that it was like in December of 1835, Zagoskin had this play called The Malcontents. It was actually commissioned by Nicholas I. He was asked to write a play making fun of Chaadaev and one other person. And the play was like, it's terrible. I mean, it's actually kind of hard to read because it's really bad, but it was performed. And I mean, it's sort of like just to think about what does it mean that like the Tsar commissions a play about you that's performed, you know, and your character in the play is this just idiot windbag who can't do anything, who never does anything. So like, what is your response to that? Well, maybe the response is like, gosh darn it, I am going to publish that first philosophical letter no matter what. I'm going to do something, right, to show that I am capable of acting. And you describe me as like, it's basically, you know, another version of the Chaadaev Yets in Zagoskin's play, like the most negative one yet. And then you take that voice, if your Chaadaev's very creative in a way, and write the letter or your essay in that tone itself, but do it in such a way that it shows something very powerful about Russia rather than the opposite, if that makes sense. So to me, it's really intriguing that 1835-36 moment, like he keeps trying to publish, and then like, why does it actually happen in 1836? I think it's in part in response to the play.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. I'll give people one last chance to speak, but it looks like we're coming close to the end of our time, and this has been an incredibly rich presentation, wonderful собеседник remarks. I think that we're all going to have a lot to think about, and I also know that several people have messaged me privately saying they were sorry that they couldn't be here because of teaching, but they'll be watching the Zoom recording, so that'll be a great resource. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Ingrid. Thank you, Katerina. And we will see you, I hope, in February when Joan Neuberger and her co-editors and co-authors present Picturing Russian Empire. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me today. And thank you, Ekaterina. I really appreciated your remarks.
Yeah, perfect pairing. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.